Thank you so very much for this really wonderful award. Coming as it does from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, which has made such a difference in understanding the brain and how it goes awry, named as it is for Dr. Pardes, who has made such a difference in the lives of millions of individuals with mental illness, and awarded with such two remarkable colleagues, I am particularly honored. Thank you. Stigma against mental illness is deeply ingrained. It makes itself known in the decisions society makes and in the behaviors that society tolerates. Newspapers and television print or broadcast remarks about people with mental illness that would not be tolerated if made about any other minority or disadvantaged group. Stigma insinuates its way into decisions about access to health care, health insurance, job discrimination, and research priorities. Those who have mental illness also stigmatize themselves. They do not or they cannot demand of their lawmakers the health care systems which they deserve. Their expectations of society are low and not consistent with the large voting bloc they represent. Such self-stigmatizing has damaging consequences. It inhibits acknowledging illness, it decreases the odds of seeking treatment, and it makes less likely the acceptance of treatment once it is sought. The inability to discuss mental illness in an informed way, to deal with it as the major public health problem that it is, cannot be justified in the 21st century. There is stigma against mental illness within the clinical community as well, from doctors, psychologists, nurses, and social workers who have no serious cause to examine their own beliefs because their professional communities have not thought it important enough to see to it that they do. Most clinicians are compassionate. There are far too many who are not. There's another group that contributes, albeit unwillingly and unwittingly, to stigma. This is a group I think of as the silent successful. People who get well because they receive good clinical care, because they can afford good clinical care, and because they are the beneficiaries of a first-rate research enterprise, but who are reluctant to speak out about their mental illness for fear of personal or professional retribution. This is understandable, but their voices would be helpful. Silence perpetuates the misperception that people with mental illness do not get well. As a result, what remains in the public eye are those individuals with mental illness who are untreated or inadequately treated. Newspaper accounts of violence, the mentally ill who without homes are out on the streets, and the untreated mental illness that people see in their friends, colleagues, and families. What is not seen is those who have been successfully treated, who compete, who succeed, and who live full and meaningful lives. Everywhere I go in the United States and Europe and city after city, I see the suffering of those who do not avail themselves of treatment because of fear, a lack of information, and stigma. So what can be done about stigma? First, find another word. The word stigma stigmatizes. The word discrimination, on the other hand, has a satisfying legal reading to it. Discrimination against the mentally ill is a civil rights issue and should be treated as such. Second, it is essential to understand why stigma exists. Just saying that stigma is wrong is not enough, and it certainly will not change the way that things are now. Thus, ethology teaches us that animals discriminate against those who show even subtle differences in appearance or behavior. Almost certainly, there are ancient hardwired reasons for fear and discrimination. We, like other animals, fear that which is unknown, unpredictable, or potentially dangerous. It's important to address this through information, priority, and when necessary, the law. The emotional, financial, and physical costs of mental illness are high, not only for those who are ill, but for family members, friends, employers, and colleagues. Legitimate concerns must be dealt with forthrightly, far more so than has been done to date. Third, individuals with mental illness and their family members need to recognize their political strength. We are a significant percentage of the population. We are a very, very large block of voters. Fourth, we need to make more effort to address discrimination that exists in the medical and mental health communities. There needs to be more honest and intelligent discussion about mental illness within the ranks of those who are responsible for treating the suffering of others. We need to make it easier for doctors and students to receive good psychiatric care without being professionally penalized for seeking help. We need to be unambiguous that mental illnesses are common, painful, and potentially lethal within our professions, and we need to be clear that they are treatable and that we will extend a warm hand and a competent hand to those who need help. Finally, we need to convey to the public as well as to our colleagues how extensive our scientific understanding of mental illness really is. We know a lot. Public awareness of the science underlying mental illness lags decades behind what science has taught us. We should campaign for science on the positive, try to captivate the minds of the public about the excitement and wonder of brain and behavior. We are fortunate to live in a time when genetics, brain imaging, and the development of new treatments have radically changed the lives of those with depression, bipolar illness, schizophrenia, and other psychiatric disorders. Researchers have advanced the field enormously, and research advances have been and will continue to be the most potent destigmatizer. Most people, although still frightened and misinformed about mental illness, know much more than they did even 5 years ago. Public education campaigns and the widely advertised availability of effective medications and psychotherapies have made an impact on public attitudes, but not enough. All of us need to recognize how vulnerable so many of our family, friends, and colleagues are, and reach out accordingly. Then we need to reach out to the rest of society to let them know that we will not tolerate the intolerable, that we will not tolerate the kind of pain and discrimination that has gone on for far too long. I would like to end with a few personal remarks about stigma. I have taught in academic psychiatry departments all of my professional life. And as someone who has suffered from bipolar illness since I was 17, I have been painfully aware of the kinds of jabs and wounding stereotypes that mental illness elicits, even from the informed. Yet it was only when I wrote a book about my illness that I became truly aware of the extent of discrimination that people with mental illness face. The decision to write about my illness was difficult. I am a clinician and an academic. I was well aware of the potential loss of my state license and my job, and the unavoidable change in how my colleagues would see me. But I was unavoidably aware of the suffering experienced by those with mental illnesses such as my own. I looked inward and then around me. It did not take much to grasp that privacy and reticence made life more difficult than it needed to be. Silence about mental illness bred a quiet ugliness and set in place the conditions for unnecessary suffering and death. Privacy was of deep concern to me, but it came at a cost. My parents had taught me to keep private matters private, but they'd also taught me to think for myself and to have a sense of responsibility toward others. Yet I could not but dread the reactions of my academic and clinical colleagues. Those who specialized in psychology or psychiatry would present a special set of problems. I risked newly vigilant eyes observing my actions and appraising my moods. Newly honed ears that would listen for skips in reason, real or imagined anger. It was an unattractive prospect. I knew too that for many, the question of professional impairment would be a critical one, and that this would be a completely legitimate concern. Legitimacy didn't make it any less disturbing, however. I would also be giving live ammunition to competitors or to anyone I had irritated over the years. I had hallucinated and been delusional on more than one occasion, been paralytic with depression for months on end. My behavior at times had been bizarre and disturbing. By anyone's standards, I had been severely ill. I had tried to kill myself and nearly died from a massive overdose of lithium, the same medication I had written about in medical journals and strongly advocated that others take. In the early stages of my illness, I had taken lithium only fitfully and with reluctance. One could hope for understanding, but not assume it. I spoke with the chairman of my department at Johns Hopkins, in part because I respected his judgment, in part because I really had to. I told him I hoped it might be helpful to others to write about my oddly intersecting worlds, those of researcher, clinician, teacher, and patient, but that I did not want to put the Department of Psychiatry or the Johns Hopkins Hospital in an awkward position. There were very real legal, educational, and clinical issues. My chairman listened carefully as I laid out my concerns. When I finished, he looked at me and he said, "You know, Kay, you have it completely backwards." He mentioned the legendary surgeon William Halsted, who was the first chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins. It was known by Dr. Osler and others that Dr. Halsted was a cocaine and morphine addict, he said. When he was impaired, his colleagues took it as their responsibility to protect Professor Halsted's patients. But he added, they also looked after Professor Halsted as best they could so that he could continue to do his research right and train young surgeons. If Hopkins can't do that for you, he said to me, Hopkins has no business being in business. He could not have been more intelligently sympathetic. He made it clear that I had his unequivocal support and that I should let him know if anyone on the faculty or house staff made things difficult for me. He arranged for me to have lunch with the president of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, who likewise gave me his complete backing. He stated that Johns Hopkins should be at the forefront of lessening the stigma against those with psychiatric illnesses. Both he and my chairman were unambivalent in their message that they would back up my decision in whatever way they could. They gave me the blessing of a great teaching hospital. I am not so naive as to think that this is usual in medical schools and hospitals. I know that it is not, but it is exemplary. And it is from the exemplary, not from that which is done badly, that one learns and moves forward. Thank you, and thank you again for this lovely word.